The storm rolled over the valley like an angry beast, lightning tearing through the sky as if trying to claw open heaven itself. And that was exactly when Cole Maddox, quiet cowboy, widower, and owner of the biggest ranch for 30 miles, felt something tug at his senses, something he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. And so he followed it, boots splashing through puddles, hat pulled low, lantern in hand. He pushed through the sheets of rain toward the old barn near the edge of the property, expecting maybe a coyote or a loose calf, but never a child. Yet when he stepped inside the barn, breath misting in the cold air, the lantern glow spilled across tiny fingers curled around a handful of hay, and there she was, a little girl no more than 3, barefoot, trembling, curls sticking to her cheeks, eyes wide not with fear but with a kind of quiet heartbreak no child should ever carry. And the moment Cole knelt down, she froze like a startled fawn, watching him as if she wanted to trust but had been taught the world could hurt, and he softened his voice to a whisper, telling her everything was okay. He wasn't going to harm her, just needed to know where she came from. She blinked slowly, tears catching the lantern glow like liquid gold before she parted her tiny lips and breathed. The words that punched the air out of Cole's lungs, "Mama's dying outside," and suddenly the storm felt colder, reality sharper, because her voice held no exaggeration, no childish misunderstanding, only truth, raw and thin and trembling. Cole stood instantly, scanning the barn, scanning the open field beyond, heart pounding louder than the thunder as he scooped her into his arms. She didn't fight, only clung to his shirt with desperate fingers, and he hurried out into the storm, shouting into the darkness, calling for anyone who might answer. But all he heard was wind and distant thunder until, finally, near the fence line, he saw it. A woman collapsed in the mud, soaked through, barely conscious, her breath shallow, hands still stretched, out as if reaching for her baby even in her last moments of strength. Cole dropped to his knees beside her, checked her pulse, weak, fading, and he knew without thinking that if he didn't move fast, if he didn't act now, the little girl would lose the most important person in her world. He carried the woman in his arms with the child still clinging to him, stumbling through the storm toward the ranch house, kicking the door open, laying the woman on the couch, covering her with blankets, lighting the fire, working with the urgency of a man who had already buried one person he loved and refused to bury another. All the while, the little girl sat by her mother's side, whispering tiny pleas-like prayers. "Mama, wake up. Please wake up." And each whisper tore something inside Cole, reminding him of his own daughter he'd lost years ago, the grief he'd buried beneath ranch work and silence. As the storm raged outside, he worked through the night, warming the woman's body, giving her water slowly, tending her cuts, staying awake to make sure her pulse never stopped. And hour by hour, breath by breath, she clung to life until finally, just before dawn, the woman stirred, eyelids fluttering open, voice cracked but alive as she whispered her daughter's name, and the little girl broke into quiet sobs of relief as she crawled into her mother's arms. Cole stood there, exhausted, soaked, shaken, a cowboy who thought he'd hardened his heart forever, now watching life return to a stranger he'd found in the mud, and something shifted inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose, connection, the spark of something he didn't dare name. And as the dawn light crept into the room, brushing gold across the mother and child, the woman finally looked up at him with gratitude deeper than words. And though she tried to speak, Cole just shook his head softly and told her to rest, told her she and her little girl were safe now, that as long as they were under his roof, nothing would harm them. Outside, the storm quieted, but inside the ranch, something new had just begun. Morning came slow and soft, sunlight creeping through the windows like a blessing after a night sent straight from hell, and Cole Maddox found himself moving through the kitchen with a gentleness he almost didn't recognize, making breakfast while the little girl, Emma, he'd learned, sat at the table swinging her feet, clutching a cup of warm milk with both hands, watching him with those big, hopeful eyes that made something melt inside his weathered cowboy heart. Across the room, her mother, Lena, rested wrapped in blankets on the couch, weak but awake, her dark hair falling around her face like a storm-touched halo, and though she barely had the strength to lift her head, she kept whispering thank you in a trembling voice that Cole waved away each time, because gratitude wasn't what he wanted. He just wanted them safe, wanted the fear in Emma's eyes to fade, wanted the weight in Lena's voice to lift. And as Lena slowly regained strength, she finally began to explain how she had been fleeing an abusive husband who owned land across the state line, how she'd been hiding for months, moving from place to place with her daughter, how last night the truck broke down in the storm, how she tried to find shelter but collapsed before reaching the barn. Each word tightened Cole's jaw, made his hands curl, because he knew men like that, men who thought control was ownership, who broke instead of protected, and he promised her, quietly but firmly, that nobody would hurt her again, not as long as she was on his land. Lena looked at him with disbelief at first, then with relief so deep it startled him, because Cole wasn't used to being looked at like someone to trust, someone to rely on, someone who could save instead of lose, and something about her gaze awakened a softness he thought the world had taken from him forever. Days passed, then a week, the ranch becoming a small pocket of peace for the broken mother and her brave little girl, and Cole found himself laughing again, laughing when Emma chased the chickens, when Lena teased him gently about his terrible coffee, when the house filled with a warmth it hadn't held since his own family was alive. He taught Emma how to feed the horses, held her tiny hand as she learned to pet them without fear, watched as Lena braided her daughter's curls on the porch while humming songs. Too soft and sad for words, slowly, painfully, Lena's strength returned. Her bruises faded, the shadows under her eyes softened, and one evening as the sun dipped behind the hills, she stood beside him in the barn doorway, watching Emma play in the hay, and whispered, "I don't know why you saved us, but I thank God you did." And Cole turned toward her, seeing not a stranger but someone who had carried too much pain, someone who deserved more than fear and running, someone he found himself wanting to protect in ways he didn't yet understand. But peace never lasts long for people running from monsters. And one night, just after sundown, the sound of a truck engine tore through the quiet, headlights slicing across the yard like knives, and Emma froze mid-step, whispering with trembling lips, "Mama, he found us." And Lena turned pale as frost, gripping her daughter with shaking hands. Cole stepped forward without fear, eyes cold, shoulders squared, every inch the cowboy who had survived battles the world never knew. And when the man stumbled out of the truck shouting threats, Cole didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His silence alone was a warning. He told the man to leave, told him Lena and the child were under his protection now, told him this land wasn't a place he'd walk into and walk out unchanged. And when the man lunged forward, Cole moved like a storm breaking free, disarming him, pinning him in the dirt, making him understand in one bone-deep moment that the days of hurting Lena were over. The sheriff arrived minutes later, hauling the man away, and when Lena collapsed into tears of relief, Cole wrapped his arms around her, not as a rescuer, but as someone who had been rescued too, rescued from loneliness, from grief, from a life without warmth. And as Emma wrapped her tiny arms around both of them, whispering, "We're safe now," Cole finally felt it, the feeling he thought he'd never know again. Family, new beginnings, the promise of a life rebuilt. And though the story of how they met began in a storm, everything after that began in the soft quiet that followed, where hearts finally had room to heal. And to everyone watching this story, if you want more tales of rescue, courage, and love rising from the ashes, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the next story is already on its way, and you won't want to miss it. The days after Lena's husband was taken into custody settled into a quiet neither Cole nor Lena had known in years, quiet not of fear but of safety, a kind of stillness that felt like the earth itself was finally exhaling after holding its breath too long. And every morning Cole woke to the smell of coffee Lena made in the kitchen, to the sound of Emma's giggles drifting down the hallway like sunlight. And though he tried to tell himself it was temporary, that they'd leave once Lena got back on her feet, a part of him ached every time he imagined the ranch returning to its old silence. Lena, meanwhile, moved through each day with the strength of a woman who had survived storms most people couldn't imagine. Her bruises fading, her steps steadier, her smile returning in pieces like dawn spreading over a valley. And sometimes Cole caught her humming, while she cooked or brushing hay from Emma's curls while the child sat on the porch swing, and something warm flickered in him, something he thought had died with his first wife. Longing, the hope of a future he'd stopped believing he deserved. But Lena seemed to sense it too, because now and then she'd look at him with eyes soft and searching, as if she felt the same unspoken pull. Yet peace was a fragile thing, and one late afternoon when the sun hung low and the horizon turned copper and rose, A new threat rose without warning. News from the sheriff that Lena's husband had been granted temporary release for further questioning due to legal complications, meaning he wasn't gone for good, meaning he had every opportunity to come back and finish what he started. Lena's hands shook when she heard it, her breath stuttering as fear clawed its way back into her chest, and she whispered, "Cole, what if he comes here?" But Cole stepped close, lifted her chin gently, looked into her eyes with a steady calm that made her trembling fade, and told her he wasn't going to let anything happen to her or Emma. Not now, not ever, because they weren't alone anymore. Still, the news cast a shadow over the ranch, tension humming in the air like an approaching storm, and Cole doubled security, repaired the fence lines, reinforced the doors, kept his rifle close, watched the road with the vigilance of a man who had already chosen who he was, willing to protect with his life. Lena helped where she could, though fear lingered in her eyes at night, and one evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, she found herself sitting on the porch steps beside Cole, Emma asleep inside, fireflies blinking across the yard like sparks from heaven, and the weight of everything pressed between them until Lena whispered, voice trembling, "You saved us, Cole, but I don't want to just be your burden." And Cole turned to her slowly, eyes dark with emotion he'd tried to bury, and said, "You're not my burden, Lena. You're my reason to breathe again." And the words hung there, raw and true, and Lena's eyes filled with tears, not of fear this time, but something deeper, something fragile, because no one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had seen her as worth loving,